when approaching an era of silence short story in any capacity, or any era of silence project of any length that's like a standard narrative, you have to consider the common willful and kind of stubborn animal the average nerd is, and the way that speculative fiction is often resigned to a lower order of stories. I have nothing wrong with action stories, and the one I'm writing right now counts as one. It's a bit of a heist short story, but I do find there's kind of two angles with EOS stories that I find, and when you really get into it, they kind of start going back and forth. You get a bit of both. The novel, I try to do both of these, but you've got type 1 EOS scenario is standard, science fantasy dash punk genre trope stories framed to introduce unique and interesting world building elements that might be hard to engage with in a completely new context. A lot of like weird chemi stuff, spore-borne technology makes more sense when you're engaging with like, oh well, it serves, the spore drone serves this role of like this kind of tech, this kind of infiltration bot tech in this scene, and well, that makes sense. Okay, so the spore drones can do that. Okay, and so a lot of it is the way that people get really freaked out with very, to me, not very like hard concepts to grasp. But I am an individual fairly schooled on abstract thinking and counterfactuals, as the history degrees would say, and I spend a lot of time thinking about like, well, if you change this, how does society change, and the cascading theory, and you got to be careful because you can't attribute singular causes to things, but it's thought experiments and such, and they find decent home in a thing like EOS. But more importantly, so that's like the type 1 scenario. The scenarios I tend to prefer and tend to lean towards is using those unique world building elements to tell human stories. Fundamentally, there is nothing about Era of Silence that is inhuman, and if anything, it is one troubled woman's attempts to make sense of the human on her own terms. So, really, any interfacing, you'll eventually find the core of it. The way I'm writing, this one faction, considering, this group of libertarians in my town where I grew up, or, Torin Varen as a reflection of death and, my father, and my own recent aneurysm at that time. Rook as kind of just a therapy tool, the trespasser as well, spoilers, but, so, just like, those are the two directions, and certainly this short story right now feels a lot more like the former, built around this, and a lot of these things come into me as a phrase, rarely do I have an immediate concept, so like, the current short story was like built off of like 2 or 3 connecting thoughts over time. The first thought being the idea of Kiara, a country with relatively clean air thanks to a successful terraforming project that makes them kind of miles above the civilizations of the West, and I do like that, because I do like challenging the idea that like any one place is in any way privileged. The Westerners talk about their love of Rome and all that. I tend to talk about that too much, but out there in India and China, we have these like cradles of civilization that are also not a different phrase, but these very like powerful civilizations that in many ways challenge the narrative of like, ooh, empires are doomed and all that. We have a lot of very contiguous states out there that last for a very long time, and even when they don't, remain relatively stable in the same form. And Kiara is kind of a challenge to the idea that the Parathan Empire that invents and masters alchemy is anyway the inheritor of civilization. Kiara has a lot more figured out. I would imagine it's a much nicer place to live than Astael, but because of that, it's not a place I can really tell most of the stories. But still, like the idea of like a clean air zone story, cool idea. the Millennium King is this idea I've had in my head for a while. Started as a phrase they sometimes do. The Millennium King lives forever. The Millennium King dies every day. And I sit there thinking about it for a little bit. What the fuck does that mean? Okay. Well, you know, we have, you know, historical records of, you know, like, you know, illusionary, like, god king myths that, like, very few people in their populace tend to believe. They tend to, you know, very few Egyptians believed the pharaoh was a true god. It was seen as religious practice, and we tend to overvalue how much the ancients, you know, had, you know, no conception of myth or, you know, imagery. Humans are creatures of narrative. I do say this, and, you know, even though it's our sincere belief had some limits on it, because, you know, well, sure, Pharaoh might be a god, but look at him. He's coughing. He's sick. He's inbred. So, you know, that vibe. And so, like, the Millennium King being this, like, you know, I will get into it. It's a little bit of a spoiler for the new story, but the Millennium King being, like, this very, at least in their own conception, a ruler who has been around since before the silence ever started. So, 10,000 to 11 years, anywhere between 10,000 and 1020, depending on if you, which calendar you go off of. I love calendar wars. So much in religions about that. But, yeah, so think about the new story and just kind of the directions the stories flow. And I definitely prefer the character stories, but my last one was Vulture City, and that was very much a use unique elements to tell a human story piece. And at some point, you gotta give the people what they want. What people want is, you know, sick, little, weird combat action scenes, and I'm decent at those. So, shit, what the fuck was that? Alright, driving back.